Hi, I'm Martin Kelly of Friends Journal, and today I'm here with Rhiannon Grant. Rhiannon is a member of Central England Area Meeting and is on the staff of Woodbrook, the study center there in England. And Rhiannon's going to talk about her new article here, Confidence and Complexity, Holding Firm to Multiple Religious Connections. So welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. So in the article, you talk about having multiple religious connections and identities. There's the Quaker,
Mm.
there's Druid, there's Buddhist. So the first question comes from your article. What does Rhiannon think she's on about with this incoherent bundle of eclectic nonsense? That was your question.
It was my question.
That
I
was your
let
question.
myself in for it when I wrote that, didn't I?
Yeah.
I think sometimes it's useful to try and articulate what might a reader be thinking, and perhaps people don't go to that extreme, but it can be a useful, I suppose, rhetorical device to try and put that into words for people and say it's okay if you are thinking that. So,
Mhm.
what am I thinking when I bring those things together? I think one way to understand this would be to think about the different ways that those religious traditions have arrived in my life. So I grew up as a Quaker, but then, particularly as a teenager, I was very interested in goddess worship and paganism, and that exploration led me to Druidry and especially to that emphasis on nature and really valuing accurate observation of the world around us
No.
as part of a religious path. Um, and I came to Buddhism mainly through meeting people and through going on retreats. And particularly, I went on a couple of retreats with Thich Nhat Hanh, who started the community of interbeing, and people
Yeah.
might have heard of Plum Village in France. Um, and found some of that teaching really useful, and having friends and family members who are also involved in that community is a big part of my connections there. So one way of saying it is what I think I'm doing is working with the things that have come into my life and seeing how they fit together and trying to discern what's useful to me, what's developing me spiritually, and actually what's not helping, what will I maybe step away from or need to deal with in a different way. And there are parts of all of those traditions that I find difficult at times.
Sure. And that sort of next question I have, it feeds into what you were saying there. What parts of these traditions sort of feed into the Quaker tradition? So, Quakers have long been interested in botany. I mean, partly because Quakers weren't allowed to, gamble or carouse or party necessarily. So they really got into like flowers and birds and really learning this. And it's been a strong part of our tradition. And so the Wiccan part is definitely related to that, as you say. Are there other ways that it sort of fed into kind of feelings that you already had as a friend?
Yeah, I think so. There's that about observing the natural world. I think all of the traditions have quite an emphasis on trying to tell the truth and articulate things as they actually are.
Mhm.
And they might have different understandings of how things actually are at different times, but that emphasis, particularly in Buddhism, on trying to see things clearly and to look deeply into what's really going on has a really positive synergy, I suppose. It works well together with a lot of ideas in Quakerism. And I also find it creative and really helpful sometimes to identify the places where maybe they differ. So particularly as a teenager, one of the things I was really interested in paganism was understanding the divine as feminine. And that is also something that Christian and Jewish and other feminists have explored.
Mhm.
But it's maybe particularly obvious in some pagan, Wiccan, Druid traditions. And that was something that wasn't really there in the Quaker tradition for me. We
Right.
can have an understanding of the divine as feminine or as gender neutral or sometimes as masculine. And obviously, we draw on that Christian tradition where a masculine divine is quite often the pronouns that people give to God are he and his.
Capitalize the he and him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Uh, So yeah, I think there were ways in which that was able to bring a kind of balance, and that diversity of ideas was really helpful for me.
Yeah, and so what about the ways in which they may conflict? So I'm thinking Wiccan is a very ritual based
Mm,
tradition. At least, I mean, there's all sorts of different types of Wiccan pagan
yeah.
traditions, but oftentimes there's a lot of ritual in that, and Quakers traditionally are kind of a little wary of ritual. So what are ways that these things sometimes conflict, and how do you sort of integrate that into your life?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. So I think maybe Druidry has less emphasis on the same ritual every time
Mm,
than some neo-pagan traditions do. But there is this talk about ritual. I think it was when I started meeting with groups of actually quite eclectic neo-pagan groups who would say, well, we've made up a new ritual for this year. And I thought, well, you're using the word ritual, but it's not the kind of ritual that early Quakers were objecting to, because they were worried about doing something empty that wasn't meaningful. And if you're making up a new one every year and being spontaneous and responding to what's really going on in your life, then
mm,
actually the conflict isn't quite as obvious as it might seem at first. There can be conflicts, and in particular, pagans do have a big emphasis on times and seasons, and really looking at the natural world and recognizing what's going on there. And early Quakers would have been against that, definitely. But again, I think we can bring them together. And if we look at certainly British Quakers today, quite a lot of British Quaker meetings are celebrating Christmas, and
oh
they
yes,
are having a children's play and mince pies and
U.S. ones as
parties.
well, certainly. Mhm.
Yeah, so I think there is that recognition that human beings need some kinds of patterns in our lives. And for me, tying that to natural seasons and to those kinds of things that Quaker botanists and ornithologists and people who are observing the natural world really closely would notice, there's a kind of truth telling and acknowledging what's really
Mm,
happening there,
mhm.
which is productive. And it is different from the previous Quaker tradition, but it kind of works with where we've got to at the moment.
Right, you're just trying to find that honesty as to who we are now and
Yeah.
articulate that. Yeah. Um, so you sort of use a metaphor in your article about like recipes, and we find the recipes and the mixes that work well for us.
Mm,
Um, the sort of question, the flip side, is what do we do for like corporate identity?
mm,
And you wrote here, lack of articulation can be a problem when we're thinking about religious belonging. So you are, in addition to all this that's going, internal stuff, you are a
mm.
public friend. You present on Quaker topics online, in person. You write books. You write articles. You're very involved. So when it comes time to sort of address an audience, well, what do friends believe? How do you do that?
Well, maybe this comes from my academic background, but my first thing would always be to identify what my sources are. So to say, this is where this comes from. I learned this from, and that might be quite an informal source. It might be, this is what I observed when I was a child growing up in a Quaker meeting, or it might be, this is what I learned from a druid I met once at Glastonbury, but it might be, this is what's in Quaker faith and practice. This is what's in a book of discipline. This is what's in the writings of a historical friend. This is what's in the tradition, and where I can point to, these are my sources for it. I think that helps people to know where it's coming from and to work out what's going on. But then also, those friends are going to have their own discernment process. And even within the Quaker tradition, we have different understandings. If you and I tried to explain what's happening in meeting for worship, we might put it differently. We'd have different emphases, even if we have really quite similar understandings in some ways. And so people have to do their own discernment and work out what language works for them. And quite minor things, we might say, are we going to call it the Quaker business method, or are we going to call it meeting for worship for church affairs, or are we going to call it? And they have different emphases, and those phrases are useful for explaining the same thing in different contexts. So yeah, I think it's about being aware of those sources, always being able to say, this is where it comes from. This is my evidence that this is what Quakers do, or this is what Quakers think. But also knowing that people are going to go through their own discernment process and have to work things out for themselves to some extent.
Yeah, one of the things that I have been trying to figure out and wrestle with myself is how, early Quakers, they would say, they were speaking from the source of, divine power within them, the inward Christ, and they didn't point to authority really, except the Holy Spirit right there. So I've been trying to not always start like what do Quakers believe with the history lesson, and these authorities. So but it's
Hmm.
I don't know if you can really get away without talking about the history and kind of the descriptive of who we are and what we are now. That kind of a
Hmm.
priori, is it just out of nowhere that the George Fox could do, that Margaret Fell said, what canst thou say? It's not just based on authority. Is that just something we can't do now, 300 years later?
Yeah, so I think that what I'm doing there isn't so much an appeal to authority as a contextualization, a
Okay.
positioning myself within a tradition. So the other kind of authority that I have is that I can say, this is what I say, and in order to contextualize that, people need to know that I've learned from Quaker sources and from Druid sources and from Buddhist sources and from lots of other places as well. And they might want my whole library list. If you're an academic looking at where people's ideas come from, you want everything they ever read. But people can get an idea from quite a broad contextualization. And I think it's about that. It's about putting it in context in the same way that we might say, okay, George Fox said this, and some of the other things that were going on around him that might have influenced him were other Quakers, were other debates that were happening in society at the time, were the things that were happening with the Civil War, the things that were
Sure.
happening with politics and the Restoration, right?
Yeah, he
In
wasn't
order to
outside all of history himself, sure.
No, exactly. So I can speak from what the spirit says to me now, and people who are interpreting that need to have the context in order to understand that and to say, okay, so this is the spirit plus some of Rhiannon plus some of Rhiannon's cultural context,
Yeah.
and then they can use their own discernment about how to understand that.
Sure. I just wonder also how that discernment happens. I'm thinking, as you say, we all have different identities that we run around with. I'm thinking whenever you're, a new social media service is there and you're writing your profile and it's like, well, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, Quaker's going to be one of them, but there's going to be 5 or 6 other things that are out there. And like I know right now for me, the war in Ukraine sort of brings this out. I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of Ukrainian friends, and my wife goes to Ukrainian Catholic Church. One of my colleagues at French Journal is Ukrainian. So when the invasion happened from Russia, I felt it personally to some extent, not like others would, but and when they pushed back the Russian forces, I was like, yay! But that's not necessarily the good Quaker pacifist thing. So how do we wrestle with these when part of our identities is saying like, yay, like push back the Russians, and the other part saying, no, we need to have a world of peace and not be sending more bombs. I think we all have parts in our life where maybe we wrestle with this. So how do we do that discernment? Is there a magic way, or do we just have to go through it?
I think to some extent we just have to go through it.
Yeah.
I think discernment is a skill that you can practice and get better at. And I think we see that in our Quaker communities, that we can practice our discernment processes and learn to keep to the discipline of them and find that easier with time. But yeah, in our own lives, we're always going to have to be in this kind of triangle between what's going on in the world, like the situation in Ukraine or whatever else, and there are
Yep.
plenty of other things happening in the world as well,
Yeah.
and ourselves and how we feel about that and how we relate to that, and the divine, the spirit or goddess, however we understand that. We're trying to listen to that and to say, what insight is the spirit bringing into this situation in which I find myself? And, you know, sometimes we can see something that we can add to it, um, some message that we're given or something that we're led to do. And other times, and certainly in my life, sometimes I just have to sit with really uncomfortable things and say, I don't know what to do.
Mhm.
And I think there is a Quaker practice of waiting. And, you know, in teaching about Quaker business method, we might say, you need to give it long enough, even if it seems urgent.
Mhm.
Sometimes this process just takes the time it takes. And things like how to reconcile pacifism with the existence of horrible violence in the world, and in any particular situation, how can we speak into that situation with peacemaking, with compassion for everyone involved, with God's love for them,
Mhm.
but not always knowing, not always from our particular social location, being able to really feel that or to really show that. And that's because we're human, and that
Yeah.
probably is just what we have to live with. So yes, unfortunately, I don't have an easy answer for you there.
Well, that sounds like a good process, though, and sounds very much in line with how we Quakers have been bumbling along for 350 years trying to make these decisions and discernments. Um, well, thank you for coming on here for the French Journal Author Chat, and look forward to, I'm sure you're looking at our upcoming issues and thinking about other things to write, so we'd be happy to see more material from you, Rhiannon, and hope you have a good day.
Thank you very much.